Hello and welcome to Big Screen Book Club, the podcast where we examine a short story or novel and the movie that was inspired by it. And this episode, I am thrilled to have joining me, host of I Must Break This podcast, Sean Malloy. Sean, welcome.
Hey, what's up, man? Thank you for having me on I guess this isn't the inaugural episode, but it's been a bit that you've done one of these, so.
Yeah. So it's almost like a reboot, if you will. And I know I've been on your podcast a couple of times, so it's good to have you on mine. And you've also been on, I guess what I would call my flagship podcast, the Slycast. You've been on a couple of episodes of that with me. So why don't you, before we get started on today's episode, why don't you tell me a little bit about I Must Break This podcast?
Yeah. Thank you for letting me plug. I started it about 2.5 years ago, and I actually just recorded the 50th episode, which is really wild and weird to say. But basically, it's a fan podcast that celebrates the career of the amazing thespian that is Mr. Dolph Lundgren. Basically, I think out of all the action heroes that came out from the 80s, I've always found Dolph Lundgren to be, not only has he always been my favorite, but I found him to be the most fascinating. And so each episode, I have a guest on with me, and we break down, pun intended, one of his films in his impressive filmography, and we've been going in chronological order. And currently, we are at the year 2007 in terms of his filmography, and it's been a lot of fun. I think a lot of people know about Dolph Lundgren. They know him due to the pop culture and some of his more popular roles, but some of the smaller films that he did that went direct to video, I don't think get the attention and the cred that they should. And so, it's my hope with the podcast that I expose people to some of the other things that he's done. And it's actually been really, really rewarding in a sense, because I've kind of, over the past couple years now that I've been doing it, I've kind of gone into a format of sorts where I do a movie review episode, and then in between the movie reviews, I have an interview episode. And so I've gotten in contact with just a ton of people who have worked with Lundgren over the years, from screenwriters to directors to actors, you name it. So it's been a lot of fun, and I've been very blessed to have gotten to get into contact with everyone that I have.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. And the one thing I've learned in this, amazing age that is the internet age, it never hurts to just ask. You never know what the answer will be.
Yeah, it's been, I've been extremely fortunate in that no one has told me no, and everybody who I've spoken to has been so gracious. I mean, if you would have told me 5-6 years ago that I would be getting to speak to Dolph Lundgren's stunt double, who, has doubled for him in almost 20 different projects, I wouldn't believe it. But I've been able to speak with him. I got to talk with Uwe Boll. I'm sure everybody knows who Uwe Boll is. And then just recently, I got to speak with a wonderful character actor, Robert Miano, who you've seen probably show up in just about every gangster film. I got to speak with him a couple days ago for an upcoming episode. So it's really been rewarding. It's been pretty cool. Obviously, the hope is that I'll get to speak with Mr. Lundgren one day for the show. But in the meantime, it's been really cool to talk with everyone who has interacted with the guy.
Yeah, and you did have a chance to meet him at a recent comic convention, right?
Yeah, I did. It was extremely brief. I mean, it was so brief. I wish I could have had more time, but you know how those things are, Craig. You're like me with those things,
Absolutely. Yeah, I remember the time me and my Tricorder Transmissions co-host Jeff Hewlett met William Shatner. It was like a drive-by,
Yeah.
But you still got that picture, and it's an awesome picture.
Yeah, I got the picture with a big dopey grin on my face. But I did, I did shake his hand, and I did tell him that I was a big fan. I did mention the podcast, and he shook his head and he smiled and he said, "Hey, thanks for the good work." And we kind of, we moved along. The photographer more or less was like, "Okay, move along." So, but yeah, no, it's been pretty cool.
Yeah, and you know what? There's probably, if I did a little bit more research, there would be an opportunity for a big screen book club. The one that instantly comes to mind is The Punisher, which we all know is based on a Marvel comic book. Now, I don't recall that movie being based on any particular arc from the comics, although the Thomas Jane movie borrowed heavily from the Garth Ennis run. But that would be fun to probably spitball about, the differences between the movie and the comic book, because I love the Dolph Lundgren Punisher movie, but it took quite a few liberties from the comics.
Well, I think, we look at it now and say, yeah, it did take some liberties, but you also got to think about when it was made. I mean, that film was in production and made in 1989. So, I mean, if you go back through and you look at the Punisher comic book series, they really didn't have a whole heck of a lot to pull from. They had, I think it was a 5-issue miniseries, and then it was around that time, that's when the full-on run had started going. Because I agree with you completely. They did take some liberties, but to be fair, they really didn't have a whole lot of material to really draw from at the time.
Right. That was probably one of your early episodes, huh?
Yeah, that was episode, I want to say it was episode 4, if I'm not mistaken. And, that one was a missed opportunity. I feel like, I don't want to use the word tragedy, but I feel like with Mr. Lundgren, he has had some opportunities to where he could have been the next Arnold or the next Stallone. And if you look at him now, to be perfectly honest, Craig, I feel like now, in a lot of ways, he's actually bigger than those other guys, thanks to a lot of the pop culture surrounding him.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at him back in the 80s, he had Masters of the Universe, where he played He-Man. That could have skyrocketed him, and that's what the movie was intended to do. But unfortunately, the company that made that one was going bankrupt while it was being filmed, so they just didn't have the legs to market the film properly. So that film, Masters of the Universe, crashed. Then he did Red Scorpion. Same thing, which was kind of his opportunity to do like a Commando-type film. That one also had a production company that was on its last legs. And then if you look at Punisher, I honestly think if Punisher had gone theatrical as intended, then that could have made him the next Stallone. But again, I feel like it's so unfortunate because he was always in these films that were being fronted by these companies that were going out of business. So
yeah. Now, is my mind playing tricks on me, or was he in a very, very brief moment of A View to a Kill?
He was.
Okay.
That was the film that actually got him, because he was, as the story goes, he was dating Grace Jones, who was in View to a Kill, and they needed an extra for the scene, and so he was there with Grace Jones. So it's pretty much a role, if you blink, you'll miss him, but he is in View to a Kill.
All right, excellent. So I will include a link to Sean's I Must Break This podcast, and it's a lot of fun. I've had a blast the times I've been on, and had so much fun talking Johnny Mnemonic with you, which is just a great, great Dolph movie where he truly chews the scenery. And that is actually another Dolph movie we could have done here on this show, because it was adapted from a William Gibson short story.
Right. Which, yeah, and I was so fortunate to have you on for that particular episode, because I unfortunately was not able to read that short story prior to our recording. So it was wonderful having you on, because you lended a certain sense of credibility to that one. So,
oh yeah, excellent. You're very welcome. And today we are focusing on a sci-fi short story. This one is substantially shorter than Johnny Mnemonic, and we're talking about the 1963 short story 8 O'Clock in the Morning by Ray Nelson, that was later adapted into a comic book by Ray himself and an artist named Bill Ray as Nada, and adapted by John Carpenter for 1988's They Live. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Before we get started, Sean, what is your sort of They Live story?
It's weird because I actually came to the party late on They Live, actually. I didn't catch it until I was in, I'd say, my late teens or so, I want to say. So in about the late 90s or so is about when I was finally able to get around to it. And, I don't know why I never really caught it earlier in my youth, because I remember it was on cable all the time.
It was a staple.
Yeah, but I didn't really catch it then. I wish I had. I had no idea that this was based on a short story, let alone a comic book, before we sat down here. But it certainly has that feel of being a comic book, especially considering John Carpenter cast an action figure in the lead role in the form of Rowdy Roddy Piper. I do have kind of a funny story with this one. It's one that I saw always, like I said, it was always on cable, but I never sat down to it. And when I finally decided I wanted to check it out, none of the video stores near me at the time had it. And so I had to go on eBay. And I did find a VHS copy of it on eBay back in the heyday when I was buying all of my used media from eBay. And I did find an old VHS copy that I did watch, and I loved it. I mean, there's so much about the film They Live that makes it the classic that it does, from the casting of Roddy Piper. I mean, my God, right there, we could talk about that. And then the 6-minute fight that's in the middle of the movie between him and Keith David. I mean, that right there is one for the ages. And also, I mean, I imagine we're going to be talking about this as well, but I think one of the things, Craig, that I think make this one stand out as maybe not being one of John Carpenter's best, but I think what makes it one of his most memorable is without a doubt the look of the aliens, those skull masks with the glowing eyes. I mean, that right there, I think, is an amazing production design.
Absolutely, and we will talk about that. This was one that I saw in the theaters with my brother, and my Aunt Ellen took us to see it, and it's kind of funny because my Aunt Ellen and my Uncle Mike, her husband, they were like the aunt and uncle that were kind of closer in age to us than they were to our parents. So they were kind of still young. So they introduced to us to a lot of cool stuff. That's probably the first time we ever saw Escape from New York was over at their house. And my Aunt Ellen took us to see it in Valley Stream on Long Island. Thank you to my brother for reminding me of where and when we saw it. And the funny thing about John Carpenter, Sean, is I can't think of any other filmmaker, and maybe you can help me here, that has so many different favorite movies from people. You know, certain filmmakers, they all have that one movie that everybody knows them for. But with John Carpenter, you've got Halloween, you've got They Live, you've got Big Trouble in Little China, you've got The Thing. He's made 2 masterpieces, I would say. But it's just funny that there's people that will cite, you know, They Live as their favorite movie, but then you've got, this is the guy that also made Halloween. I mean, yeah, it's kind of wild. Can you think of any other filmmaker that's got that kind of batting record?
Well, I mean, I think the obvious one that comes to mind is Quentin Tarantino.
Right.
But I think he's really the only director who really has that kind of pull. I'm trying to remember when it was, but there got to be a certain point where he had the pull to where he could put his name at the front of the movie, to where it was not, for example, Ghosts of Mars. It was John Carpenter's Ghosts of Mars. Or I'm trying to think, what was the one that he did with Sam Neill that's now In the Mouth of Madness? Yeah, that was not In the Mouth of Madness. It was John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness. And I think when you get that kind of juice and that kind of pull, man, that's cool, you know? It's funny, as I was listening to a podcast actually about a week ago or so that was reviewing one of his films, and they were talking about how he hasn't done anything within the past few years. And I mean, he did one back in 2010, I guess. I haven't seen it.
Yeah, The Ward.
Yeah, but I'm thinking, you know, in my opinion, I don't think the guy needs to. Like, I mean, he's had so many classics, and there's no way, especially in today's age, Craig, because whatever he does nowadays is going to inevitably be compared to what he's known for. And why would he set himself up for that kind of failure, you know?
Yeah, and I don't think he's one of those people that is willing to play the games that you need to play to get a movie made nowadays. I think he's got enough money, and say what you want about these remakes they crank out. It seems like every other year there's a John Carpenter remake. And for the record, John's completely happy with them. He gets a check in the mail. It sort of keeps the name or the movies alive. And, you know, I'm sure he makes a pretty penny off the Halloween franchise alone. He's also making music with his son, which is pretty neat. He's put out 2 albums called Lost Themes that are, you know, kind of just soundtracks to movies that I guess he never made.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's the other thing, too, is he's known not just as being this amazing director, but he does the score to his films. And I'll just say right now, I love They Live, but I think, picking my favorite is going to be hard, but I think I'm going to be in the minority here, and I'm going to say my favorite of his has to be Vampires. I think the combination of John Carpenter and James Woods is just amazing. Say what you will about James Woods, I'm not going to get into that. But he's awesome in that role. I mean,
him and it's Billy Baldwin or Daniel? It's Daniel Baldwin.
Daniel Baldwin, and arguably probably the biggest movie of his career.
Yeah. They're both great in that. That is also based on a novel called Vampires, where the S in Vampires is written with the $sign. I read it probably when the movie came out back there in the late 90s. I don't think I held on to the paperback. If I did, it didn't make the cross-country move with me. But that's another great one. I'll even go to bat for Ghosts of Mars. I think Ghosts of Mars is a lot of fun if we're talking later day John Carpenter. again, like I said, that guy had a run of films that it's so funny. There's people that know the movie Halloween, but they don't realize that it's the same guy that made Big Trouble in Little China. And They Live has sort of gone on to become its own thing. And you mentioned Roddy Piper earlier on. This movie, I think 100% we talk about in 2020 because of Roddy Piper. Roddy Piper on the commentary track for this movie, which was recorded in the early 2000s, from what I can tell, which is included on the excellent Shout Factory Blu-ray release. Roddy said that this movie saved his career. And it was really great that John Carpenter went to bat for somebody that he knew he needed in that movie. He needed somebody, I believe on the commentary track, he says genuine, someone who's believable, somebody who's lived a life.
Yeah, it's funny because I actually remember watching a documentary that was put out by WWE on the life and the career of Roddy Piper. And they actually did get an interview with John Carpenter. And I remember him saying the same thing. He said, in so many terms, I can't remember exactly what, but he was like, look, I don't care if it's a big name. I don't really need a big name for this role. I like this guy. I like the look of him. I like what he's going to bring. And that just kind of shows you the kind of creative juice and power that Carpenter had at the time, to where Universal was like, all right, Carpenter wants Roddy Piper. Let's give it to him.
Yeah, and the other thing is John Carpenter in 1988 delivered this movie on a budget of $3 million. It would go on to make $13 million, so there was a return on the investment there.
Yeah.
And the thing that amazes me about that, Sean, is the movie was shot completely in LA, where, can you imagine shooting a movie in LA today and what that would cost?
Oh, yeah. It's amazing. I think all those cities, LA, New York, wherever it may be, it's hard to believe that at a time, but that it was that cheap. But no, I agree with you.
And I think that also sort of lends to the overall look and feel of that movie. It's got a great gritty feel to it. Carpenter talks on the commentary track about how a lot of the homeless people in that movie, in that camp that Nada stays in, were real homeless people that he actually, paid and fed to be in that movie. And again, I don't think you can pull something off like that today. I mean, it's just got a real street sort of vibe to it. And it goes a long way to sort of establishing that movie as sort of being unique and different and memorable.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah, a great supporting cast as well. We've got Keith David, who was previously in John Carpenter's The Thing, and Meg Foster and her amazing, amazing eyes.
Well, and I'm going to throw out a Dolph Lundgren connection here. I think, I don't quote me on this, but just 1 year prior to doing this film, she starred as Eva Lynn in the Masters of the Universe movie.
Right, yeah. Great connection. So, John Carpenter adapted this movie from a short story called 8 O'Clock in the Morning by Ray Nelson, as we mentioned. But the interesting thing is, Carpenter's entry point was a 1986 comic called Alien Encounters Number 6 that included the story Nada, that was written by Ray Nelson and illustrated by Bill Ray, which was sort of an updating that Ray Nelson did of 8 O'Clock in the Morning. Carpenter read the comic, searched out the story, and then bought the rights to adapt it.
Yeah, no, like I said, I had no idea that this was based on a short story. I mean, I've heard the title before, 8 O'Clock in the Morning, but I never really taken the time to read it prior to this. But I can certainly see why Carpenter decided to buy the rights to it, because, I mean, this lends itself perfectly to the style. I mean, and maybe it's because I'm reading it through the lens of, okay, I saw the movie first. So obviously when you see the movie first, you're going to be kind of having some pictures already painted in your head. But as I'm reading it, I'm looking at it, I'm thinking this feels like it would fit within Carpenter's wheelhouse perfectly.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things about adapting short stories is you've got the perfect amount of material to work with. And it surprises me that more filmmakers don't focus on short stories, because what are you going to do with a 1,200-page Stephen King novel? You're going to make a movie that pisses a lot of people off, probably. Here, Carpenter was working with a 5 or 6 page short story, which actually Carpenter had to build around. So I think short stories really offer the most for adaptations. So talking a little bit about Ray Nelson, he's a science fiction writer. Again, he wrote 8 O'Clock in the Morning. It was published in the November 1963 issue of Fantasy and Science Fiction. You can also find it in a collected edition called Real Future, Reel. So I assume that's a book that collects all short stories that were adapted into films. That came out in 1994. And then also the Young Oxford Book of Aliens. He's written a lot of short stories. And he also wrote a book, or co-authored a book called The Ganymede Takeover with Philip K. Dick in 1967. And Philip K. Dick is, if you don't know his name, you definitely know his impact because he was the writer behind what eventually became the movie Blade Runner. His short story, We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, became Total Recall. Scanner Darkly is based on one of his stories. Ben Affleck's Paycheck. There's a million movies I could probably run down. We could probably devote an entire podcast just to the movies that were adapted from Philip K. Dick stories and novels.
Yeah, no, it's extremely impressive. It's funny because as you were mentioning every one of those stories, I'm like, oh yeah, wait a minute, that was Total Recall, right? That was Paycheck there, right? You know, I mean, and you know, I think that there's something to be said too. I mean, talk about what could be other podcasts. Because when was the story written again? You said 1963?
1963, yes.
Yeah, there's something to be said about science fiction literature that came out in the 60s. I mean, because I had never read any Ray Nelson before this, but I've read a lot of Ray Bradbury. And there's just something interesting about what was coming out of science fiction literature in the 60s that really resonates today, that really resonates in society today. And I mean, if you want to look at Bradbury, a lot of his stuff came out in the 60s and the 70s, and talk about a visionary that man was. I mean, my God, I mean, the stuff that he predicted, I mean, if you look at Fahrenheit 451, he pretty much wrote about our society that we're living in today.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating to me that he was able to see that and predict that and write it.
Absolutely. A lot of the sci-fi I read in the 90s when I was reading a lot of sci-fi was from the 50s and 60s, and that was definitely a very, very special time for science fiction.
Yeah, yeah.
The main element that Carpenter took from this story, and it's amazing that Ray Nelson wrote this in 1963 because it seems just as, you know, resonant now as it did probably back then, but the idea that we are being manipulated by a higher power. In Ray Nelson's story, people are being influenced by the TV to basically be subservient and to just be good citizens. I think there's a line in the story, something like work 8 hours, play 8 hours, sleep 8 hours. Basically, that's the concept that John Carpenter really, really latched onto. Now, the interesting thing is, in the short story, it starts with the character of George Nada. He's named John Nada, and he's referenced just as Nada in They Live, but he is at like a hypnotist show. So he basically comes out of this hypnotist show. He's woken up, quote unquote, by the hypnotist, and all of a sudden he sees things for the way they really are. Again, that's sort of a device that Carpenter had to figure out. The story starts with, you know, the awakening, and the thing I was really surprised by, Sean, is how it culminates at a TV station. You know, for as many differences there are between the movie and the short story, they kind of end the same. The comic book kind of flipped the story on its head a little bit because it went to a first-person narration. We have George telling us the story, and of course we're seeing things, and one thing that was interesting in the comic book Nada, what the aliens look like. Do you have anything you want to, you know, talk about specifically about the short story or the comic?
Well, with regard to the aliens, I mean, as soon as I started reading it, as soon as it mentioned aliens, my mind is going immediately to the aliens from the movie, how they looked, you know, with those skulls and the glowing eyes.
Yeah.
Whereas in Nelson's short story, they're more reptilian. He keeps referring to them as reptilian with multiple eyes. And then if you go to the comic book story, they're not so much reptilian, but the artist in the comic book does acknowledge the multiple eyes, but they're more monstrous in their appearance. I think in the end, the big thing that I've heard that Carpenter was going for with the movie, and that's, I'm assuming this is how he interpreted the short story as well, is it's just an attack on consumerism.
Right.
You know, it's a satiric commentary, if you will, on how we are blindly led due to our consumerism in the country. So I think depending on how you want to look at it, I think you can go a variety of ways with what Ray Nelson and Carpenter, for that matter, were trying to say about society.
Absolutely. So again, the main thing was, Carpenter had this 5 or 6 page short story to work from. And I think one of the biggest changes he made, and probably, one of the best devices he used, was the sunglasses. Carpenter knew that there was no way he could make this a hypnotic thing, or waking up from, being under a hypnotic trance. So the idea of having these magical sunglasses that let you see things the way they really were, I think is a big improvement Carpenter made on Ray Nelson's story. It's a device that allows us to sort of travel between realities, if you will. And it gave us so many great story moments there. What are your feelings on Carpenter's approach to how Nada starts to see things the way they really are?
So we're talking in terms of the film version then?
Yeah.
Because the short story, it opens with immediately our main character of George knows that something is amiss. And so, kind of like what you said in adapting a short story, you have a little more leeway to build a world and to flesh out a much longer story. So, yeah, I like the sunglasses. This was the 80s. And so sunglasses look cool. So I kind of liked that angle as well with the film. And if you want to look at just the overall look and aesthetic of Roddy Piper, he just looks, we haven't really mentioned it, but I don't know who the costume designer was and the wardrobe designer on the film was, but he just looks so badass in the movie. And if you think about it, it's not like he has this elaborate wardrobe, but he makes it look so cool. He had those jeans and then the tucked in flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, the sweet mullet in the back, of course, and then rocking those sunglasses. He pulls it off and it looks so cool. So yeah, I think the sunglasses was an amazing touch.
Yeah, and one other element that they sort of added in the movie that didn't exist in the short story was the character that Keith David plays, Frank Armitage, which is funny because Frank Armitage is also the credited writer of the movie, which is Carpenter writing under a pseudonym. So in the movie, we get a buddy character that doesn't exist in the short story. I'm always kind of skeptical when characters are created out of thin air that didn't exist in the source material. But again, I think this was another good choice on Carpenter's end because it gave somebody that Nada had to convince and to join up with him, which gave us one of the most legendary fights in cinema history. It's this nearly 6-minute fight between Nada and Frank where Nada is convincing Frank to put on the sunglasses. I'm sure you've all seen that scene, even if you haven't seen the movie. What did you think about the addition of the Frank character?
I think it works. To be honest, considering the time this came out, 1988,
yep,
I appreciated the fact that they had Roddy Piper's character team up with another male. Because if you think about this, Craig, a lot of these movies, when you have this, when your main character is a larger-than-life muscular figure like Roddy Piper is, they usually have him team up with a female, right? If you think about Commando, Schwarzenegger teamed up with Ray Don Chong, then The Running Man, and even Rambo: First Blood Part 2, he teamed up with that one gal. And I think what that does is, I think the writers were acknowledging, okay, our character, our lead hero is almost otherworldly, if you will. So we need this kind of human element to ground him, in a sense, if that makes sense. And so, honestly, I could have seen them having Nada's character teamed up with a female. And to be perfectly honest, I think the film would probably, I don't want to say it would work just as well, but I think it would, you could still tell the story and it would still work. Having said that, I think the chemistry, though, between Roddy Piper and Keith David is just amazing. Keith David, my God, he's an amazing character actor as is. But the two of them teaming up and kind of, at first they're at each other's throats a bit, and then eventually they, we've seen this kind of relationship and dichotomy before, right? Mm-hmm. But when they eventually do team up after that long fist fight in the alley, the payoff is worth it. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. And I appreciate, your sort of exploration of the character being a male and having, making it a sort of a buddy picture instead of the obvious choice, which would have been a female. And I'm surprised also that Carpenter didn't go that direction based on the story, because in the story, George has a fiance named Lil, who he goes to visit right after he's awoken, and she doesn't really do anything in the story other than get tied up and witness him murder one of the fascinators, which is what they're called in the story. So I'm surprised that Carpenter didn't take that nugget and sort of run with it. But I guess Lil was kind of part of the ingredients that created the Holly character that Meg Foster plays.
I think so as well. And I mean, can we just say, my goodness, the way they drew her in the comics, in the comic strip was very. You could tell that artist had a couple things on his mind, but yeah.
It's my understanding that comic book, Alien Encounters, caught a little bit of flack for its depiction of the fairer sex. It didn't last that long, but definitely in this comic you can see why people might have gotten a little worked up.
Most definitely, yeah.
So, I mean, again, to talk about the way the story ends, the way the comic ends, and the way the movie ends, they're very, very similar. I mean, basically, Nada realizes that people are being hypnotized by the TV. That's driving everything. And that if you destroy the signal, things will go back to the way they were. Now, there are some differences in the story. Basically, Nada goes to the TV station, he kills all the fascinators, and he basically tells people over the air to wake up, and it's alluded that a war starts that he never gets to see, because in the short story, basically starts with him getting a phone call saying he's going to die at 8 o'clock the next morning, and true to the phone call, he does die of a heart attack at 8 o'clock. Now, in the movie, the aliens are being shielded by kind of a satellite receiver or something, and that's what Roddy Piper destroys, that allows people to see everybody, even in real life, for what they are. Any thoughts about how the story ends versus how the movie ends? The similarities and differences?
Not a heck of a lot. I mean, I kind of wonder, and this is how I took it, Craig. I don't know if you would agree with this or not. But I kind of wonder, with the fact that they are both ending at a TV station that deals with satellites, do you think they're also making a commentary, maybe in a loose way, perhaps, on just the media in general and how the media has the ability to present bias and persuade consumers and the audience into thinking a certain way? That's kind of what I was wondering they were kind of saying with that. Carpenter's thinking, okay, well, I'm going to end the story in a location that's extremely similar to the short story, because I think that the idea is very salient here. The fact about media and the public and, viewing television and, you know what I mean? I mean, I don't know. I guess I'm kind of rambling here, but that's kind of what I was wondering they were trying to say about it.
Yeah, I definitely got the takeaway that, the whole concept of TV rots your brain, and that, you're not always going to get the right information from TV. I think, and there'd been talk that they were going to do a true adaptation of 8 o'clock in the morning. I think around 2011 it was talked about. I'd imagine if you made this movie today, that sort of idea would be driven home even harder, based on the divide we have in this country, where now you've got basically two sets of news networks that are trying to influence their watchers. I definitely don't want to see this adapted, mainly because I think it's not really a story that needs to be told again. It was told in a comic book, and then it was told in a movie after the short story. So we've got 3 mediums we can enjoy this in. And that kind of gets me to sort of the final question, if you will, Sean. Do you think that John Carpenter succeeded in adapting the Ray Nelson story, 8 o'clock in the morning, for the big screen?
Most definitely. I think what really helped him with this is the fact that it's a short story. I mean, and you already touched upon this already. I think if this was a full-on novel, I mean, I can't get into the headspace of Mr. Carpenter, but I can't help but wonder if this was a full-on novel or if it was longer than the 6 pages that it was. I kind of wonder if Carpenter would have even touched it, to be perfectly honest. I think he saw that there was an idea there that he could still add his own Carpenter style and flavor to. And so that's kind of what attracted him to it. So yeah, I think it is certainly a worthy adaptation. I appreciate you exposing me to it because I do try to read, when I can, but I always like seeking out new things, especially things that are, let's face it, pretty old. And to get to read something from 1963 that was not too heavy to digest. I mean, you can read it within 10 minutes and still get the impact of it. I think also what attracted Carpenter to this is, we haven't talked about it, but the story is pretty simplistic. I mean, it's made up of lots of simple sentences and lots of very simple paragraphs. I mean, paragraphs that consist of 1 to 2 lines.
Right.
I mean, so it's a very quick read, and I think Carpenter saw that and he kind of looked at it as a blueprint. Maybe not even a blueprint. I think he looked at it as an outline, and he said, "Okay, I can run with this."
Yeah, absolutely, and I'll agree with you. I think Carpenter did succeed in adapting this. I would call it a worthy adaptation. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find out what Ray Nelson thought of it. Ray is still with us. He's in his late 80s. But any of the digging I did prior to sitting down, I couldn't find really any talk of whether he thought this worked or not. I'm sure he made some money off of it, so good for him.
Yeah, most definitely.
But again, I think the short nature of this, and again, like you said, there wasn't a lot of exposition in the story, really allowed Carpenter to sort of fill in those gaps and John Carpenter it up, if you will. The short story is definitely worth searching out. Episodes like this are easy to prepare when you only have to read a 6-page story as opposed to a 200 or 300-page book.
Yeah. And there's quite a few works of literature out there that I would love to read. If you ever are gracious enough to invite me back for one of those, I would be more than willing to do it again. I would just need a little bit of time to to prepare.
Yep. Well, I've already gotten a commitment from co-host on 2 episodes of this show, BJ Cramp, who does the excellent Rock and or Roll podcast. We're going to do Death Wish at one point, and I know me and you talked about doing the follow-up novel and the Kevin Bacon movie, Death Sentence.
Amazing movie. Pretty good book, too. So when you're ready, I'm ready and I'm willing. So
yeah, well, those will be really interesting. Now, I know that the book and the movie for Death Sentence are very, very, very different. But I really, really look forward to that discussion, but also covering Death Wish because, not to spoil anything, but the filmmakers there, they really missed the mark in terms of, presenting the author's sort of concept. So I look forward to that. But again, that's going to be an episode that requires a lot more prep. Here, we were able to basically throw this together, I think, 2 weeks ago. I probably floated the idea of doing this episode, and you graciously volunteered, and here we are less than 2 weeks later, I think, recording the episode. So Sean, thank you. I think we kind of ran down the differences between the short story and the movie enough for people to maybe be interested in going and searching it out. But if not, I think the next time you watch They Live, you might have a little bit more of an understanding of what Carpenter was working with.
Yeah, most definitely. And, now that I'm thinking about it, talking about Carpenter adaptations, I can't believe I forgot about it, but he did Village of the Damned. And wasn't Village of the Damned based on, I don't know if that was based on a book, but wasn't that based on another classic film, if I'm not mistaken?
You know what? I think it was a movie in the 60s. Let's see, 1995's Village of the Damned. It is a remake of the 1960 film
Children of the Damned, right?
Yeah, which was based on a novel called The Midwich Cuckoos by John Wyndham. So it is based on a book.
So it's not like Carpenter obviously They Live may have been his first time kind of dabbling in the adaptation thing, but it's not like it's something that's completely foreign to him. So
no, and actually, The Thing is, a lot of people call that a remake of The Thing from Another World.
That's right.
But it was based on a short story by Joseph Campbell called Who Goes There? And from every indication, I have not read Who Goes There, but from every indication, Carpenter was a little bit more faithful to the source material than Thing from Another World. And it's funny, Sean, because people always call The Thing a remake of The Thing from Another World. And in my opinion, anytime you're adapting a book, you're not remaking the movie. I mean, I think one of the big conversations that people have had recently is Stephen King's It. And people, reference It and It Chapter 2, and they compare it to the miniseries from the 90s. But, they weren't making the new It movie based on that miniseries. They were making it based off of King's book. The miniseries just happened to get there first.
Exactly. I think I always think it's a little unfair to look at that. I mean, kind of going full circle here, but I mean, if you look at The Punisher, for example, I mean, a lot of people say, I remember when the Thomas Jane one came out, they thought that one was so much superior to the Dolph one because he finally had the skull. And, and you got to think, 1989. I mean, comic book movies were not where they are today and where they were in 2004.
Yeah.
So back then, in 1989, when they were making that movie, a character running around with a giant skull on his chest might have looked a little bit silly. As is, they were taking a bit of a gamble making a movie based on a comic book, because back then, those are not big things. So yeah, I always thought that argument was a little unfair when they say, oh, it's so much better. I mean, if you think about Stephen King as well, when he oversaw production on the Shining miniseries that came out in the late 90s or whatever, he was saying, oh, this is so much better than the Stanley Kubrick one. And I'm thinking to myself, well, the Stanley Kubrick one was actually fine as well. Like, why are we...
Yeah, I think if anything, the Stanley Kubrick one might have failed as an adaptation, in terms of staying true to King's sort of vision. But in my opinion, in order to be a successful adaptation, you don't always have to adhere completely to the novel, because things that work in book or short story form might not transfer to the big screen. So a lot of times, filmmakers make those choices. One of the big choices Carpenter made here was to replace, waking up from a hypnotic trance to just putting on sunglasses. And that's absolutely a story device that worked. And Carpenter knew that. So I don't think filmmakers always need to be slaves to the source material. But at the same time, I think it's foolish to dismiss stuff in the source material that would clearly work on the big screen.
Well, and then you get into kind of tricky territory, too, because if you... Dr. Sleep, that came out a few months ago, which is the sequel to The Shining, well, then they had a delicate balance there, because they were saying, okay, this is the sequel to The Shining. We want to be faithful to Stephen King's book, but let's face it, Kubrick's movie is a classic.
Yeah.
So we have to acknowledge that. And so when that movie came out, it was kind of wild watching it, because they're really towing this really delicate line in a way where they want to be faithful to the text, but they also have to acknowledge the Jack Nicholson Stanley Kubrick movie, because no one really wants to see a sequel to the miniseries with Rebecca De Mornay, even though it was more faithful to the book. You know what I mean? So
right. Yeah. And that's one, it's sort of waiting for us to watch. We just haven't sat down to watch it because it's quite long, and, you have to be in the proper mindset for that. So I'm looking forward to it. But, that's the one thing I love about movies is there's the source material that they draw from. And anytime you see a movie, you can go home, get on Google, and even if it's not based on a book or a short story, in the case of, I think, Live Free or Die Hard was based on a magazine article, you can find the origins of that movie somewhere and go down rabbit holes and sort of explore the themes and the ideas that led to the making of that movie. And that's one of my favorite things about films, is sort of exploring where they came from and how they ended up the way they did. So again, Sean, I want to thank you for joining me for this. And before we go, are there any final thoughts you have on 8 o'clock in the morning, Nada, or They Live?
No, I think I said everything. I just appreciate you extending the invite to me today, sir.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and I look forward to talking with you again. And again, make sure you check out Sean's podcast, I Must Break This Podcast. I'll send a link. And Sean, is there any preferred way you'd like people to find the podcast?
We're on iTunes or Stitcher, those podcasting apps, or they can go to the website, which is I Must Break This Podcast, all one word, .wordpress.com. And that just has a running list of all the episodes.
All right, excellent. And we look forward to future installments of that. And I look forward to joining you again on this show. But for now, we're going to call it an episode. Thanks again, everyone.